So what we've been waiting for almost 4 years has happened. Negotiations between the United States and Russia aimed at resolving conflicts in Eastern Europe took place in the capital of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh. The very fact of the meeting has already become a real sensation, like a bolt from the blue. But the real shock came later, when it became clear that the negotiations had been very successful, and their results could lead to tectonic changes in world politics. Friends, this issue is definitely worth your attention. So let's not delay. Let's get started. Initially, those who were not aware of what was happening were the Europeans. There are questions in Brussels. How is it that the Americans are negotiating with Russia without the participation of European allies? After all, in recent years, it was Europe that harshly opposed anti-Russian rhetoric, imposed sanctions, sent weapons, and now suddenly it turned out that its opinion was completely ignored at a key stage. And there was a real panic in Brussels. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said with indignation that no peace agreement without the participation of Europe can be considered legitimate. Next, Ursula von der Leyen supported her with a tougher statement, arguing that peace with Russia is possible only through force, and all negotiations without weakening Moscow make no sense. However, the situation was already out of control, and Brussels was faced with a harsh reality. Washington no longer considered it necessary to coordinate its actions with its European allies. Of particular concern was the news that French President Emmanuel Macron has urgently convened an emergency meeting of NATO leaders in Paris. Obviously, a collective response to the fact that Europe was sidelined and ignored was being discussed. European countries have invested more in this conflict than anyone else. The EU economy has suffered the most from sanctions, Germany's industry has been in decline, and the energy crisis is hitting households. But now they've just been passed over. This development has become a real humiliation for European leaders, who until recently assured that no fateful decisions could be made without their approval. It is worth recalling that during the Cold War, the Americans preferred to negotiate directly with the Soviet Union, and the European allies simply faced the fact. Now, after years of demonstrating a united front, the European Union has suddenly realized that this front is more of a mirage. As soon as Washington saw an opportunity to negotiate with Moscow without intermediaries, Europe's opinion became unnecessary. The indignation of the Europeans was about the same when Washington began discussing nuclear issues with Moscow in 2020. Back then, at least they pretended that Europe was somehow notified, but now even that is not the case. EU leaders were confused. They sincerely believed that their opinion carried weight in Washington, but now it became obvious that their main mistake was precisely this belief. The statement from the head of the country, which is now actively in conflict with Russia, caused even more hysteria. The very leader who just the other day called for standing to the last, now suddenly found himself unable to influence the situation. He stated with noticeable nervousness that if they did not participate in the negotiations, then everything would be resolved without them. This happens when adults are talking in a room, and the children have to wait outside the door. Now Europe can only wonder how far this new dialogue between the United States and Russia will go, and what consequences it will have for itself. Meanwhile, negotiations on both sides turned out to be much more optimistic than expected. The Russian and American delegations stated that the meeting was held in a positive manner and there are real points of contact. But the most unexpected statement was that of the new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who hinted that sanctions against Russia could be partially or completely lifted. It really became a real bomb. In comparison, European complaints that their opinion has not been taken into account sound like quiet whining. After all, sanctions were presented as the main tool for deterring Russia, but several years have passed since the beginning of the conflict, and reality has turned out to be far from the initial forecasts. The Russian economy, contrary to the expectations of the West, did not collapse, but the European one, on the contrary, faced severe problems. Quote, "Sanctions are all the result of this conflict. There are sanctions that were imposed as a result of this conflict, and therefore I would tell you that in order to put an end to any conflict, it is necessary that all parties make concessions. We are not going to determine in advance exactly what they should be, and, of course, we are not going to negotiate today or at a press conference. Nevertheless, there are other parties who also have sanctions. At some point, the European Union should be at the negotiating table, as it has also imposed sanctions. In other words, Washington suddenly remembered that the conflict cannot be resolved without diplomacy and compromise. Yes, sanctions are a tool of pressure. But if the goal of the negotiations is peace, then it is logical to assume that this will be followed by the lifting or easing of sanctions. And that's where Europe goes into a panic state. What about our principled position? Rubio's statement came as a real shock to the European Union, and now they find themselves on a political stretch. If the United States really goes to ease the sanctions regime against Russia, then Brussels will have to do the same. And this is a strategic disaster. For so many years, the Europeans have argued that sanctions are the main tool for inflicting a strategic defeat on Moscow. They claimed that the consequences of these sanctions would be devastating and irreversible, and that the Russian economy was about to collapse. But more than 3.5 years have passed, and the picture looks completely different. Russia has persevered, adapted, reoriented trade, began to produce its own goods instead of Western ones, established payment systems bypassing SWIFT, and strengthened economic ties with China, India, and other countries. Moreover, the sanctions have become an incentive for accelerated technological development. The European Union, on the other hand, has lost a significant part of its economic power. Germany, whose industrial sector has been on the verge of survival due to the lack of cheap Russian gas, has been particularly affected. As a result, instead of the expected strategic defeat for Russia, the exact opposite effect occurred. Europe is losing its competitiveness, and the Russian economy, contrary to forecasts, continues to grow. Now Brussels faces a dilemma. If they support the easing of U.S. sanctions, it will mean admitting that their entire strategy turned out to be wrong and their long-term policy failed. This will be a formal recognition of the fact that the European Union has always followed in the wake of American politics, without having its own voice. In addition, it is unlikely that European leaders will be able to explain to their citizens why they forced them to endure high energy prices, why the industry was forced to close and the economy suffered a recession. And now it turns out that the sanctions can be lifted. All this creates huge problems for European politicians because they will have to admit their mistakes, and this, to put it mildly, is not in their interests. However, if they still maintain sanctions, despite the easing of U.S. policy, they will find themselves in an even more absurd situation. This will mean that Europe deliberately continues to strangle its own economy, while Washington, which started this game, is already ready to negotiate with Moscow. Then Europe will become a hostage to its own decisions, demonstrating political stubbornness, which will cost it dearly. Moreover, the largest European corporations have long been eager to return to the Russian market, realizing what huge profits they have lost. For example, German industrialists explicitly state that without cheap Russian gas, their production becomes unprofitable, and French agricultural companies see their niche occupied by competitors from Latin America. In such circumstances, continuing to adhere to sanctions only means continuing to harm oneself. The European Union, of course, will try to dodge in order to get out of this situation without losing face. Attempts will be made to explain the lifting of sanctions by some kind of diplomatic success, concessions from Russia, or a new de-escalation strategy. But everyone understands perfectly well that the real reason is that Europe is no longer able to withstand this economic war. And if the United States now officially launches the process of reviewing its sanctions policy, it will be even more difficult to resist. It's amazing how skillfully European politicians have driven themselves into this impasse. Instead of seeking diplomatic solutions, they chose the path of total confrontation, and now they have to deal with the consequences. As they say, we played for a long time, but it seems that we didn't play in our favor. Now we can only watch how Brussels will get out of this situation, trying to pretend that this is not a failure, but part of a subtle political strategy. Will this be a diplomatic détente, a new Cold War, or a step towards normalization? In addition to discussing sanctions, the parties also agreed to develop relations in the field of energy and space. And here the most interesting thing begins, because it turns out that the United States and Russia are once again reaching the level of strategic dialogue, reminiscent of the détente of the Cold War. Moreover, this is not just an exchange of pleasantries, but real steps that can lead to the restoration of full-fledged cooperation in key industries. Russia and the United States also announced the restoration of a full-fledged exchange of embassies and the appointment of ambassadors. This is no longer just contacts. It is a serious step towards normalizing relations after several years of diplomatic warfare, mutual expulsions, and the actual curtailment of consular services. Now there is a clear turn towards dialogue. It is particularly interesting that the negotiations discussed not only current policy issues, but also economic aspects. Apparently, the American side experienced a real shock when they were informed that after the withdrawal of their companies from Russia and the imposition of sanctions, U.S. losses reached an astronomical $300 billion. According to Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian participant in the negotiations, the Americans were extremely surprised that their own sanctions hit not so much Russia as the United States itself. Large corporations such as McDonald's, Ford, and ExxonMobil were forced to leave the Russian market, where they had been making steady profits for years. Instead, Russian analogs appeared, which not only occupied the vacant niches, but also significantly increased their profits. Whereas American businessmen can only bite their elbows now. Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, commented on the talks. There were a lot of jokes. There was a desire to come to Russia at some stage. They were surprised that many restaurants were opening in Russia. Because if you watch CNN, then everything is bad for us. This vividly highlights how Americans are beginning to realize that the media image of Russia and reality are two big differences. CNN and other Western media have been creating an image of a destroyed Russia for years, but in reality it turned out that the country not only resisted, but also succeeded in many sectors, including the development of its own economy. Another thing is also interesting. Given Donald Trump's pragmatic approach to business, he may well use this chance to restore relations with Russia. After all, he has always put economic benefits and strategic cooperation at the forefront, which means that he is unlikely to miss such a chance. Of course, this is only the first step, but the fact of the meeting and its results speak volumes. Europe, however, remains adamant in its approaches. The question is whether she has the strength to continue standing her ground, even if Washington begins to change its rhetoric. It looks like we are witnessing the beginning of something really important. In addition, Moscow insists on holding elections, but with an important condition. The new leader must be legally legitimate. The signing of the final agreement should exclude the possibility of another outbreak of confrontation. For Russia, these are not just diplomatic declarations, but lessons learned from the past, when well-known countries, including Germany, signed documents only for their subsequent sabotage. It is curious that the statements of the American side suddenly have a new emphasis on the historical, economic, and investment opportunities that may open up after the end of the conflict. This point indicates that Washington is already preparing to participate in the future redistribution of spheres of influence. However, this approach is not unexpected, as history shows that every time the United States talks about peace initiatives, it often hides a plan for economic expansion. Unlike the American side, Russia takes a more restrained but clear position. As the negotiator Yuri Ushakov noted, it is too early to talk about rapprochement, and this wording is not just a diplomatic turn, but a clear indication that the Kremlin does not intend to rush into serious agreements. The U.S. ambassador to Russia has not yet been appointed, nor has the issue of a possible replacement of the American representative in Moscow been resolved. If even basic diplomatic issues require additional coordination, one can imagine how difficult further discussion will be. Thus, so far this process looks more like a trial step, rather than the beginning of a full-fledged dialogue. Russia has also given a clear signal that the format of cooperation to resolve the conflict will be determined solely by Moscow. This means that any U.S. initiatives must be in line with Russian interests. For its part, Washington says it is committed to a sustainable and long-term settlement. However, given that, in the American understanding, long-term peace often means a prolonged freeze of the situation with the possibility of further influence, Russia will have to exercise maximum caution. The atmosphere of negotiations in Riyadh resembles a chess game, where every move is thought out, but no one reveals all the cards. The United States seeks to create the appearance of dialogue, while reserving room for maneuver. Russia, on the other hand, does not take drastic steps, carefully noting Washington's interest in the negotiations. Right now, the situation remains at the testing stage, but the coming months will show how far the dialogue will go. And now, friends, I want to express my opinion. Reading this material, I hope that all this bureaucracy and long negotiations will not prevent the conclusion of this treaty, which will become the basis for future peace. Of course, the process is complicated, and all parties need time to come to a compromise, but it is important that in the end, not only politics, but reason and the desire to live in peace prevail. We are all waiting for change, and I believe that peace is possible if everyone works on it, and not just talks. Many thanks to each of you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss important news. Be sure to share your opinion in the comments. It's very important to me. See you.